My name is Evelyn, and there was a time when I believed silence was a form of safety. I learned early how powerful quiet could be, how secrets wrapped in normal life lasted longer than any spell spoken aloud. I didn't grow up imagining candles and symbols. I grew up watching people pray with sincerity, then wondering why nothing changed for them. Back then, I knew the answer, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. The work I was taught didn't look dark at first glance. It looked domestic. It looked like kitchens, shared meals, seasonal gatherings, and well-meaning invitations. It looked like care. That's how it survives. People expect danger to be dramatic, but the most effective blocks are gentle, routine, and familiar enough to never be questioned. I was taught that belief doesn't need to be shattered to be controlled. It only needs to be delayed. If someone keeps praying but feels unheard, they eventually blame themselves. That self-doubt does the rest of the work. In those spaces, we didn't talk about attacking faith. We talked about redirecting it, softening it, tiring it out. Timing mattered more than force. Certain seasons made people more open, more exhausted, more willing to indulge without paying attention. That's when ordinary things became tools. Nothing exotic, nothing rare. Things people already loved and reached for without thinking. The brilliance of it, if I'm being honest, was how invisible it all was. I remember sitting at long tables where laughter flowed easily, where people spoke about blessings while unknowingly participating in rituals they would never have consented to if named out loud. Consent was never part of the conversation. Assumption was. We assumed people wouldn't look twice at what was placed in front of them. We assumed tradition would shield us. We assumed that if something tasted good and felt comforting, it wouldn't be questioned spiritually. And most of the time, we were right. The body relaxed, the mind followed, and the spirit grew quieter, not absent, just subdued enough to miss signals it would normally catch. What unsettled me over time wasn't the practice itself, but how predictable the outcomes became. People would say the same things season after season, that their prayers felt heavy, that something felt off but they couldn't name it, that their passion had dulled. They searched for answers everywhere except where the interference actually lived. I watched them fast from news, from relationships, from joy, never realizing how close the source was, how ordinary it looked. I began to notice how often the work relied on repetition rather than intensity, a little, again and again, until it felt like nothing at all. Leaving wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden revelation, no lightning bolt guilt. It was a slow discomfort, a growing inability to ignore how easily people were guided into confusion. I started noticing how awareness disrupted everything. The moment someone paid attention, really paid attention, the effect weakened. That's when I understood why secrecy mattered so much, why no one ever explained the full picture, why food, of all things, was chosen so often. It crosses boundaries without resistance. It enters the body with permission and gratitude. It carries meaning quietly. I'm sharing this now because the patterns haven't changed, only the speed. Life is louder, faster, more distracting, which makes subtle interference even easier. This season is no exception. The same strategies are dressed in new language, new packaging, new traditions. And once you start seeing how it works, you can't unsee it. The story doesn't end here. It's only opening the door to what usually stays hidden. There is always a season when the air feels thicker, when even the most faithful people begin to sigh before they pray, as if their breath already knows the effort will be greater than usual. I learned to recognize that season not by calendars, but by behavior. People grew more distracted, more indulgent, more forgiving of small compromises. They stayed up later, ate without thinking, skipped moments of stillness they once protected. From the outside, it looked like life simply getting busy. From the inside, I knew it was the opening we waited for. Heavy prayers were never the goal, delayed answers were. A prayer that feels heavy is still prayed, and that matters because it keeps hope alive just long enough for frustration to take root beside it. In those seasons, people talked about feeling spiritually tired, emotionally foggy, unsure why clarity slipped through their fingers. They blamed stress, weather, finances, relationships, anything tangible. What they didn't see was how the environment had been subtly prepared for that feeling. Nothing was forced. That was the rule. Force creates resistance, and resistance sharpens discernment. The work was always about cooperation without awareness. When people are already overwhelmed, they don't guard their inner gates as carefully. They welcome comfort without inspection. They confuse rest with surrender, indulgence with reward. I remember being taught that prayers don't disappear. They lose momentum, like letters written but never mailed. They sit complete, yet unmoving. During these seasons, people still believed, still asked, still hoped, but their expectations softened. They stopped listening as closely for answers. Silence became familiar, and once silence feels normal, people stop questioning it. That's when the season truly settles in, not when prayers stop, but when people accept the wait as inevitable. What made this period especially effective was how communal it felt. Everyone around seemed to be experiencing the same dullness, the same unanswered questions. That shared experience reassured people that nothing was wrong. It's just one of those times, they said, and in a way they were right. It was one of those times, carefully observed, carefully used. The language we used among ourselves was gentle. We called it lowering the volume, softening the channel, encouraging rest, words that sounded harmless, even kind. I began to notice how often people interpreted heaviness as personal failure. They prayed harder, longer, more desperately, exhausting themselves further. That exhaustion was never corrected, it was counted on. A tired spirit is less curious. A tired mind looks for the quickest comfort, and comfort, when repeated without awareness, becomes ritual all on its own. The season didn't block prayers by force. It simply taught people to carry them with resignation instead of expectation. The first food was always the easiest because people never resist sweetness. Sweetness disarms suspicion. It carries childhood memories, comfort, reward, and relief all at once. I was taught early that sugar didn't need symbolism explained aloud. The body already understood it. When something sweet touches the tongue, defenses lower instinctively. People relax, their thoughts slow, their awareness softens just enough to drift. In the work, that softness was everything. Not silence, softness. Silence can alarm someone. Softness feels earned. We used sweetness during moments when people were already emotionally open. After long days, during celebrations, after prayers had already been spoken. That timing mattered. The belief was that prayers offered on a softened spirit don't rise with the same sharpness. They still exist, but they wander. I watched people eat sweet foods while talking about hope, about faith, about waiting on answers. They smiled, laughed, felt reassured. Inside, something dulled. The urgency that carries prayer upward thinned, like a flame starved of air. What made this food so effective was repetition. No one eats something sweet once and thinks it defines their season. It's the daily reach, the habitual comfort, the unconscious pairing of sweetness with rest. Over time, that pairing trained the spirit to settle when it should have been alert. In ritual terms, sweetness symbolized consent without intention. The body welcomed it, and the spirit followed the body's lead. That hierarchy, body first, spirit second, was quietly reversed. I remember being surprised by how little effort it took. No incantations at the table, no symbols drawn, just presence and timing. Sweetness was offered with kindness, with generosity, with the language of care. That was part of it. When something is framed as love, it passes every internal checkpoint without inspection. People thanked us for it. They felt nourished. They didn't notice how often they prayed less afterward, or how their prayers grew shorter, less specific, more resigned. The idea wasn't that sweetness was evil. That distinction mattered in our teachings. Power doesn't come from declaring something bad, it comes from using it out of alignment. Sweetness during seasons of spiritual battle was believed to quiet discernment. It didn't stop belief, it distracted it. People still trusted, they just trusted passively, and passive trust is easier to redirect than active faith. I began noticing how often people reached for sweet comfort when they felt unheard. Instead of pressing in, they soothed themselves. That self-soothing became a substitute for persistence. From the outside, it looked healthy. From the inside, I saw how predictably it worked. Sweet on the tongue, calm in the body, quiet in the spirit. No fear, no resistance, just a gentle hush that settled where fire once lived. The second food was never introduced as comfort, but as discipline. That was its power. People chose it themselves, proud of the choice, convinced they were becoming stronger, more grounded, more responsible. In the circles I was part of, we respected this one the most because it required no persuasion. It appealed to logic, to self-improvement, to the desire to feel solid and in control. It was filling, heavy, and praised for its ability to sustain. In ritual language, it represented anchoring, weight that pulls downward rather than lifting upward. When eaten during certain seasons, it was believed to root the spirit too deeply in the physical, making upward movement feel slow and effortful. I watched people talk about endurance while consuming it, about pushing through, about accepting delays as maturity. They felt strong because their bodies felt full, steady, unshaken. But strength, when misdirected, becomes immobility. The spirit mirrored the body, grounded, yes, but reluctant to rise. Prayers spoken in that state carried a tone of obligation rather than expectancy. People prayed because it was right, not because they anticipated movement. That subtle shift was everything. Expectation is light, obligation is heavy. What made this food especially effective was its reputation. No one questioned something labeled nourishing. It gave people language to justify the stagnation they felt. I'm just being patient, they said. I'm learning endurance. And patience, real patience, is powerful. But what we cultivated was resignation, disguised as wisdom. Over time, people stopped asking why things weren't changing. They accepted stillness as character development. The illusion of strength kept them from noticing how little momentum remained. In the work, this food symbolized permanence. Once introduced, its effects lingered longer than sweetness ever could. Sweetness softened. This one settled. It encouraged people to carry weight proudly, to measure spirituality by how much they could endure rather than how freely they could move. I saw prayers become more formal, less intimate, less desperate, but also less alive. The fire didn't go out, it banked itself under layers of acceptance. I remember the first time this unsettled me. A woman spoke about feeling called to something more, something higher, yet every word was followed by a sigh. She ate carefully, deliberately, convinced she was honoring her body and her faith, and in many ways she was. But I could see how her sense of calling never quite lifted off the ground. It circled her life instead of carrying her beyond it. That was the design. Not denial, but delay framed as virtue. This food didn't silence prayer. It trained people to be comfortable with unanswered ones, and comfort, when it replaces hunger, quietly changes the direction of everything. The third food was the cleverest because it arrived wrapped in joy. No one guards themselves while celebrating. Laughter lowers boundaries faster than fatigue ever could. This food appeared at holidays, milestones, reunions, and spiritual gatherings meant to feel safe and sacred. It carried tradition, identity, belonging. To refuse it felt like refusing community itself. That was the cover. In the teachings I received, celebration was described as the perfect veil because discernment relaxes when happiness feels collective. People stop listening inward when the noise around them is loud enough to reassure them that everything is fine. This food worked differently from the others. It didn't slow the spirit, it distracted it. In ritual language, it created misdirection. While attention focused outward on conversation, on nostalgia, on shared enjoyment, the inner senses dimmed. Intuition doesn't shout, it whispers, and whispers are easy to miss when celebration fills the room. I watched people eat this food while speaking about gratitude, about blessings already received, about how good life was despite unanswered prayers. That language mattered. Gratitude is powerful, but here it was used prematurely, sealing questions that should have remained open. What made this food so effective was that it never appeared alone. It was always paired with meaning, stories, memories, music. The body associated it with safety and joy so strongly that any spiritual caution felt inappropriate, even rude. People didn't want to be the one who disrupted the mood, so they ignored small internal checks, those fleeting moments of something feels off. Those moments passed quickly, drowned in laughter and full plates. In practice, this food was believed to confuse guardianship, not remove it, just misalign it. The idea was that when joy is externally sourced and overstimulated, the inner compass spins. People feel happy but unfocused, content but strangely disconnected. They pray less not because they don't believe, but because celebration convinces them nothing urgent remains to be said. Prayer becomes something for later, after the season passes, but seasons stacked, one celebration bled into the next. I began to notice how often people postponed discernment in the name of togetherness. They told themselves there would be time later to reflect, to listen, to seek clarity, but later rarely came. The noise followed them home through leftovers, habits, and repeated indulgence. The food became a signal to the spirit that vigilance was no longer required, and a spirit trained to stand down on command is easier to redirect than one that remains watchful. What troubled me most was how invisible this interference felt. No heaviness, no fog, no obvious delay, just a gentle drifting away from urgency. People still believed, still thanked God, still spoke of faith, but their prayers lost their edge. They floated instead of pressing. Celebration had done its job, not by opposing prayer, but by convincing people they were already satisfied. I left slowly, not in a blaze of anger or fear, but with the quiet recognition that I could no longer participate in a system that thrived on hidden influence. At first, I told myself I was just tired, that perhaps stepping back temporarily would be enough. But the deeper I observed, the more I realized the patterns were not temporary, they were deliberate. People blamed themselves for what they didn't understand. They struggled silently, believing their prayers were insufficient, that their faith was lacking, and all the while the methods I once practiced in secrecy continued without interruption. Watching it, I felt a weight pressing in my chest, not for my safety, but for theirs. The truth of what I had known could no longer remain silent, not if it meant people suffered needlessly under what they thought was fate. Speaking out is terrifying in ways I never anticipated. Silence has its comfort and secrecy has its shield. Once you name a system, it loses its invisibility, but it also risks judgment, disbelief, and misinterpretation. I speak now because awareness, even partial, is a force that can undo cycles of quiet manipulation faster than any confrontation. Once someone begins to notice the patterns, the power they held begins to weaken. I've learned that power thrives on consent, on unconscious participation, on trust that is never questioned. Remove the consent and the spell loses momentum. That was the lesson I carried with me after I left, and it shaped every choice I made afterward. I wanted to live without that weight, but I also wanted to understand it fully before I spoke. Not everyone leaves for the same reason. Some leave because they fear being caught. Some leave because the work itself becomes boring or tiresome. I left because the consequences were too real, too tangible. The food, the timing, the patterns, everything that seemed harmless from the outside had consequences in someone's soul. People prayed and wondered why the heavens seemed silent, never realizing the subtle currents steering their intentions. I could no longer let that remain unspoken. Now I speak because awareness is freedom. I speak because truth, even uncomfortable, allows people to reclaim their voices, to ask differently, to pray differently, to see the choices around them clearly. The work I once did is behind me, but the knowledge remains. And knowledge is not neutral, it carries responsibility. I have learned that nothing holds power over us unless we unknowingly agree to it. That principle, simple as it sounds, is revolutionary once recognized. I see people still caught in cycles I once reinforced, still unaware of the ordinary things used to delay their prayers, to quiet their urgency, to lull their discernment. I left not to condemn, not to create fear, but to illuminate. The reason I am speaking now is the same reason I left: to remove the shadow from what was hidden, to give voice to awareness, and to remind those who feel blocked that nothing is inherently powerful without their participation. The patterns are subtle, the influence quiet, and yet when recognized, they unravel with surprising ease. My silence had its reasons, but so does my voice, and in this moment, I choose the latter. If you have felt your prayer slow, your intentions wobble, or your spirit grow quiet without reason, it is not coincidence. There is a rhythm to these patterns, a precision in their timing, a quiet orchestration that few ever notice. The foods, the seasons, the celebrations, they are not inherently dangerous, but when layered with intent, they become instruments of subtle obstruction. The sweetness that soothes your mind, the heaviness that convinces you of strength, the joy that distracts your focus, all of it has a pattern, a method, a deliberate effect. The most insidious influence is never dramatic. It does not shout or demand attention. It slips past awareness like smoke in the morning light, invisible until you begin to see. And the moment you see, the moment you truly understand, you begin to reclaim what was quietly withheld. Do not underestimate the small things, the ordinary, the everyday, the things you consume and celebrate without question. They carry weight. The choices you make unconsciously shape the direction of your prayers, the clarity of your intentions, the sharpness of your discernment. Your energy is not only your own, it is influenced, nudged, redirected, softened, slowed, or dispersed, depending on what you allow into your body and mind without awareness. And yet, the power to shift it back, to realign it, has always been yours. It has always rested in your recognition, your observation, your refusal to participate blindly. That refusal does not come from force or fear. It comes from seeing the invisible, understanding the subtle, and making deliberate choices that honor your spirit above the patterns set before you. Ask yourself, when you pray, when you set intentions, what is truly guiding them? Is it hunger, joy, fatigue, habit, or is it awareness, clarity, and focus? How many of your prayers drift quietly without impact because their momentum was redirected by routine comforts, by societal patterns, by celebrations dressed as tradition? How much of what you call patience is actually a veil, a polite acceptance of delay imposed by forces you do not yet recognize? This is not speculation, this is observation. I have witnessed it for years, and the patterns repeat because most never question, most never notice, most never stop to trace the currents beneath the surface of their own lives. Awareness is a revolution in itself. Once you notice, the patterns begin to unravel, the currents lose their sway, the weight lifts. But noticing requires courage. It requires honesty with yourself and refusal to accept external comfort as an unquestioned shield. It demands that you examine the ordinary things, what you eat, how you rest, what you celebrate, and recognize that nothing neutral exists in isolation. Every element of your daily life carries influence, and some influences are intentionally designed to quiet your voice, to soften your focus, to make your prayers less urgent than they deserve to be. The liberation begins when you name them, when you see them clearly, when you recognize that subtlety is never powerless. It is power itself when left unchecked. Your spirit was never meant to be passive. Your prayers were never intended to drift unnoticed, unheeded, or redirected without your consent. The strength, the clarity, the fire that lies within you has always been capable of piercing the quiet, cutting through the soft fog, and reclaiming what is rightfully yours. It is there, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be guided by recognition, waiting to respond with urgency rather than habit, with focus rather than diversion, with life rather than pause. Now the question lies with you. The patterns are revealed, the mechanisms exposed, the ordinary disguised as influence unveiled. Will you let your spirit continue to drift, lulled by sweetness, anchored by weight, distracted by celebration? Or will you rise with clarity, discernment, and intentionality, refusing the subtle currents that seek to redirect your prayers? The answer is yours, written in the choices you make, in the attention you bring, in the awareness you claim. Nothing has the power to block what you consciously protect. And so the moment of truth rests squarely in your hands, waiting, challenging, demanding that you decide what your prayers will carry, where your focus will land, and how fiercely your spirit will claim the path meant for it.